images of fear, anxiety, or violence. This lack of empathy is correlated with aberrant moral behaviour. You'll notice that there's no mention at all of God or religion in this study. If the brain is damaged, if the structures that provide the fundamental underpinnings of our moral behaviour is damaged or fails to develop, then we will not be good, God or no God. In the countless journal articles, investigations, experiments, and statistical analyses regarding our moral intuitions, there's no need to control for the possible existence of a divine being when crunching the numbers. An open-minded awareness of the naturalistic origins of human moral behaviour leads to an ever more nuanced understanding of our tendencies and capabilities. Far from casting us into some dystopian, deterministic, amoral nightmare, our progress in this area is tremendously exciting and positive. In comparison with being mired in the prescriptive and stagnant edicts of religious belief, we have an opportunity to test and investigate our reasoning and our intuitions in order to further develop our understanding of our reactions to a morally complex world. The idea of an innate moral template doesn't entail the existence of a law-giving God. Moral standards are properties that we have that are contingent on the nature of how we got here. Our biases are evident in that they represent the optimal choice, from natural selection's perspective, to matters dealing with fidelity, cheating, and killing. In so many areas, religion can be viewed as a proto-science, offering a curiously self-aware animal with a penchant for a good narrative, some explanations as to our origins in a world in which we appear to be more sophisticated than the creatures around us. The very same inquisitive nature and reason that once suggested supernatural solutions has now produced a far more compelling alternative. Our pre-rational intuitions interact with societal influences and environmental context in complex and intriguing ways. We can investigate this relationship and understand it without ever misattributing it to the influence of a God.
Thank you, Leigh. Next slide.
I just want to point out, for the sake of clarity, Ian, that I'm not one of Robert's relatives in the strictly biological sense. Can there be good without God? My interest is ethical. How should we live if God is good? And how do we live if good and God are separated? I actually don't want to live in your world, Ian, where you can separate behaviour from belief. I want to live in a world where our beliefs actually affect our behaviours. It's been said by Churchill and by Dostoevsky and by Gandhi that we judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable. And so if good and God are separated, then how do we treat the vulnerable? Let me start by saying that I'm choosing to define God as Christian. This is not because I desire in any way to privilege Christianity. It's simply because the creation of a category called theism sounds great in theory, but it doesn't work in reality. It's a bit like baby food. You take a bit of carrot and a bit of pea and a bit of potato, a bit of Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, you mash them all together and you offer them as some sort of vague theism, which simply will destroy the particularity of each vegetable or of each religion. So, can there be good without the Christian God? The Christian God has a script that God is good, that a good God creates an earth, and that in this earth all of creation, including all humans, are made in the image of a good God. And that this goodness is most clearly seen in Jesus. And thus goodness is not a theistic abstraction, but rather it's defined by the Gospels. And Ian, I do think you need to attend one of our School of Theology New Testament classes and update yourself a little bit in terms of the Gospels, which are actually, recent scholarship shows, are incredibly close to the person of Jesus, not second or third generation, and then developed amongst a community of critical people engaged in thinking about the clarity of the message of the Gospels. In these Gospels, goodness is defined not as some vague intuition, not merely as an innate moral toolbox of care for others and fairness and loyalty, but there's a far higher standard asked in terms of love for your enemies and forgiveness in the face of violence. silly, cruel, inhuman, that you love your enemies, that whatever you do for the least of one of these, you do for God. Which is interesting to then place alongside some of the atheist attempts at goodness, and we've seen some of them today. Do unto others, beside a Darwinian social survival of the fittest, offered by Daniel Dennett. Love your enemies, alongside Fran de Waal's animal empathy. I thought that your dolphin story was great until it meets a shark, and then you need a different ethic in terms of how species compete and interact. Love your enemies. Greater love has no one, alongside Sam Harrison's objective moral well-being. Just trust our intuitions and then place our intuitions amongst other subjectivities. And I actually want to argue, therefore, for the need for an objective guidance which controls our innate morals and our subjectivities. Now, what hasn't been pointed out yet is how this Christian script has an enormous impact on how we should live our beliefs with our behaviours. It's easy, I think, for us to take this for granted, to forget that when Christianity emerged, critics were simply astonished by its goodness. To quote, one found nothing in Roman society remotely compared in magnitude to the Christian willingness to provide continuously for persons in need, male and female, young and old. This is not just pie in the sky when you die, this was steak on the plate while you wait. That Christians created a miniature social welfare system in an empire which for the most part lacked social services. That when the plague struck the Roman Empire in 251 AD, most people fled, even the doctors. In contrast, Christians stayed to nurse the dying. Greater love has no one than this, than they lay down their lives. To quote from the Emperor Julian, Christians support not only their poor, but ours as well. Our goodness needs this Christian God. Consider a world without the music of Bach or Michelangelo's Pieta, Mother Teresa, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, all inspired by the Christian script of goodness. The word scripta is important. A script expects a performance, that we don't simply debate, but that our ideas actually become embodied actions. It allows me, therefore, to make three caveats to our argument. First, that we are not arguing that all Christian performances are good. Quite the opposite. There are forms of Christian belief and practice which I consider to be distinctly good-less. But the logic of script and performance. That a bad performance doesn't automatically mean a bad script. That my local theatre group might maul Shakespeare, but that doesn't invalidate their significance for Western culture. Having made this first caveat, let me plead for some truthfulness, for some factually reliable evidence when we do talk about our history. To the myth that religion is violent, let me reply that if you're a Christian and you support violence, you need to find a new religion to describe yourself. And to ask what evidence is there that secular atheist society is any less violent than any religious societies, especially given the track record of the genes in this 20th century eugenics movement. To the myths of religious intolerance, of crusades and inquisitions and witch hunts, that let me reply that in the history of witch hunts, it was the church that introduced courts to try and channel mob hysteria. That the Spanish Inquisition was an office of the state and not of the church. That the Crusades are, to quote Bentley Hart, more truly the last gaudy flourish of Western barbarian culture than the Christian ethic of love your enemies. So my first caveat that not all Christian performances are good. My second caveat is that I'm not seeking in any way to privilege the Christian God. Quite the opposite. To quote Bill Maher, Gandhi is so Christian, he's a Hindu. This is the radical nature of the Christian understanding, that a creator creates all humans, not just Christians, with the potential for goodness. And that all people made in God's image, therefore, stands against any group claiming an exclusive appropriation of God for their own side. My third caveat, that in order to perform a script, you simply must read it in its context. And this is especially important when we read the Old Testament text, to which there's been some allusion today. Does the good Christian God legitimate the slaughter of innocent Canaanites? Sorry, you all make me nervous. Such Bible passages have always disturbed Christians. In 140 AD, a man named Marcion decided that the good teachings of Jesus, love your enemies, were at odds with the God of the Old Testament, and he simply cut the Bible in two. More recently, more constructively, an Australian scholar, Mark Brett, has looked at archaeology and then has looked at when Deuteronomy was actually really written and how it sits alongside other ancient Near Eastern literature. And to quote, there's actually no evidence of mass killings. What appears as genocide is actually part of an internal social and religious reform. This is not cherry picking. This is simply reading the text that we have well and with the integrity that they deserve. In regard to slavery, the concepts we have in our minds of the roots type slavery is in no way comparable to the slavery of the Bible. And we have the narrative of Philemon and Paul, where the gospel radically changes the way that they relate to each other within their household and the community of God. In some, my interest has been ethical. How might we live when God is good? How do we live if goodness and God are separated? And I've looked for answers on behalf of society's weakest. And I don't want to trust myself just to the innate goodness that there might be in others. I want an objective standard by which I can consider goodness, and I find that in the person of Jesus. And I've used the notion of script and of performance to argue that goodness needs the Christian God. And I'll claim the honour of finishing before anyone else.
Thank you everyone for coming along. I'm pleased to see so many people here with an interest in this topic. I wasn't particularly thrilled that we'd be taking this topic on when Robert first got in contact and we were nutting out what the topic would be. I think Epicurus and Plato did a good job of that thousands of years ago, but I'll get back to that later. But it is of interest to our society today. I'd like to carry on from the sterling work done by my colleagues and showing that not only do we not need God to be good, but that not having God makes us less likely to be bad. So I'm going to speak first about the research of Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, a psychologist with the US Army, who's been studying the phenomenon of getting people to kill, which is the core job of an army. And it's actually really, really hard. They found that in the Second World War, only about 25% of frontline soldiers engaged in action were pulling the trigger. They weren't engaged... pardon me. Only 25% of the soldiers engaged in frontline action were engaged in effective fire. That is, selecting a target, aiming a weapon and pulling a trigger. The other 75% of the soldiers, they weren't cowards, they weren't running away, they just weren't engaging in effective fire. They were aiming high, they were aiming wide, they were firing wildly, they weren't selecting a target from the crowd, aiming a weapon at that target and pulling the trigger in order to kill it. There's something in the human psyche that prevents us from killing each other, and that's a really good thing because there's a lot of jerks around. But it's really, really hard to get someone to kill.